So for you, for Ayaan, it's not just academic. Where do you think the bravery comes in for you? Because I can tell there's nothing that I could possibly ask you here that you wouldn't give me the clearest, honest answer. And that isn't always how it is with everybody, obviously, as an interviewer. But where do you think that comes from you?
Candor has always been one of my greatest weaknesses. and I think I was probably brought up in a rather combative family, in a rather combative part of the world. I grew up in Glasgow in the west of Scotland, and
to a physician and a physics?
That's right. My mother was a physics teacher, my father was a doctor.
Yeah.
And they were the first in their families to go to university. My grandfathers had served in the world wars. Scots have a self-image of themselves as being courageous. The Scottish regiments were famous, I wrote about this in one of my earliest books, The Pity of War, were famously the sharp end of the British military. We marched towards the sound of gunfire, bagpipes playing. That's the self-image that a small Scottish boy growing up in the 1960s and 70s was encouraged to have. I remember vividly the day that 9/11 happened. I was sitting in Oxford, where I was then teaching, but I'd planned and was intending to fly to New York very shortly to give a lecture on 9/12 at New York University. Indeed, I was booked into a hotel very close to the World Trade Center. And my response when I saw the attacks was somewhat bloody-minded. My response was very shortly afterwards to resign my post at Oxford and go to New York University. And I taught there for 2 years in I suppose, a mood of defiance that the attempt to terrorize would not terrorize me. When I met Ayaan, more than 9 years ago now, it never crossed my mind, as I fell in love with her, which happened very fast, that this implied some meaningful threat to my person. Even when the FBI came to tell me that there had been a threat against me, something that I'd seen them do to Ayaan on more than one occasion, I never gave it a second thought, because obviously my calling, different from my grandfathers who were called to fight in real wars, my much more manageable calling is to protect her, because she's one of the great heroines of our time, an extraordinarily courageous woman who's been through a hell of a lot and who has never shirked from saying what she believes is wrong with modern Islam. So it is second nature to me to be there with her in that fight, in that war. It turns out to be my war. I always used to wonder as I was growing up, why is it that my generation isn't really being called on to fight wars the way my grandfather's generations were called on? And then it turned up. Then my war turned up.
You briefly mentioned this earlier when you were talking about Ayaan and Brandeis, but can you explain this intersection of Islamism and the left, why this has occurred? This confuses a lot of people, this idea of the oppression Olympics, and I've got plenty of theories on this that we've knocked out, but what do you think it is that has attracted something that is completely totalitarian in control with another thing that's so completely totalitarian? I mean, I guess that's the answer right there. But
well, there are many unholy alliances in history, and no doubt many people were gravely surprised when the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was announced and the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany formed an alliance. So we shouldn't be entirely surprised when seemingly odd bedfellows jump into bed. In the case of the Islamists and the left, I think it's pretty clear to me that the Islamists are the leading partner and the leftists are broadly the useful idiots. Because the Islamists have a strategy, it's there in Muslim Brotherhood and other documents. for expanding their network in the West. And part of the strategy is the kind of partnership that they have formed on campuses against their foes. One way in which this works is that you use the issue of Israel to forge the pact with the left. So you get the left's long-standing animosity towards Zionism, and you essentially say, well, we entirely agree with you about that. Let's have an event about how wicked Israel is. And so that's the gateway drug into accepting the next thing is, well, headscarves are actually empowering for women, don't you think? And isn't it actually Islamophobia to be in any way critical of Sharia law? So you play the multiculturalist, cultural relativist card, and you again depict any critics of radical Islam as in fact engaged in some kind of Orientalist project or essentialist project to other, people always talk about othering in academia, Muslims, and you blur the distinction between Islamism, and Muslims as people. So this has been going on for a while, and the left has broadly fallen for it. And to me, it's just astonishing. I remember looking at the list of academics who had argued that Ayaan should not receive an honorary degree at Brandeis, and it included professors of queer studies, female professors of gender studies.
It's incredible.
And you kind of feel like saying to these people, have you taken a look at what the Muslim Brotherhood envisages? Have you read Qutb's works? Do you realize that the project is the permanent demotion of women to second-class status and potentially capital punishment for gays? Is that something you are aware of? And I can only conclude that they aren't aware of it and have been very thoroughly duped, as useful idiots usually are.
So is that basically because both of these movements want power? So the useful idiot part of this is that the Islamists are really just using the left to attain power, and they're doing it all in the name of diversity and all of these things. And eventually, once that power is attained, then, for lack of a better expression, I mean, you basically decapitate them. And then they did it for you. They did the work for you.
Yes, I mean, I always used to joke with Ayaan that when we lived in Cambridge, it would be fun if all my enemies and all her enemies came and protested outside our house together, because after about 20 minutes, they'd fall on one another and there would be the most tremendous fight. I do think that power is part of it, but if one looks back at the history of another intolerant totalitarian ideology, Marxism, there's a combination of power and a kind of idealism, one must call it that. In the Square in the Tower, I tell the story of how the Soviets successfully penetrated the British establishment by recruiting spies in Cambridge. And the people they recruited had leanings to the left that were inspired partly by revulsion at those aspects of British imperialism or British class society that were, in many ways, legitimately open to criticism. There was an idealism there at the beginning of Guy Burgess's involvement in Marxism, sympathy with workers during the time of the Great Depression. But those were the useful idiots that the Soviets cynically recruited to be spies whom they persuaded to betray their countrymen in what was the single most successful act of Russian espionage of them all, recruiting these highly educated people from an incredibly exclusive network, the Cambridge Apostles and the related network that led to Bloomsbury. This was a brilliant strategy. Something similar is going on here, because I think there are a great many naive young people who are drawn to the rhetoric of social justice. I encounter them often. People who say, oh, there should be limits on free speech because I don't want such and such's feelings to be heard. They're naive. They have a very naive view that somehow there can be a circumscribed form of free speech in which nobody's feelings get hurt. That's not the pursuit of power. That's just naivety. And the people who know how to exploit that naivety are both people amongst the Islamists and people amongst the leftists who are pursuing power. But you can never really get to power without the useful idiots, without the naive idealists who think that they're going to build utopia with your help.
Yeah, and I don't have to tell you, that usually ends up in dystopia.
Right.
So
and
there we are.
that's something that is hard to persuade people of. Yeah, I keep reflecting on the curious revival of Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, which is always taken to be a vision of what happens when right-wing people take over America.
Yeah.
And to me, the amazing thing that is almost never observed is that something very like this has happened. It happened in Iran after 1979, and it happened after the Taliban came to power in Afghanistan. So we don't need to fantasize about crazy evangelical fascists turning women into baby machines. This has already happened, but it was done by Islamists. It was done by people pursuing an extreme version of Sharia. And yet almost nobody who enthuses about Margaret Atwood's book realizes that it is actually a really quite powerful realization of what a theocratic Islamist regime does to women.
All right, so I want to shift gears a little bit here, and we can either, I'm going to let you choose. We can either go the historical route or we can go the present route. What are you feeling first? I do want to do both.
I think the key to applied history, which is what I've spent my whole life doing, is that you do both.
All right.
And you can't do one without the other, because you can have no real insight about the present without the past. So why don't we talk about the present, and I'll try to show why, to understand it, you need history.
All right, very good. So there are a couple things that are interesting that you've staked out positions on over the past couple of years. We briefly, right before we sat down, we talked about Brexit for a second. So you originally were against Brexit.
Yeah.
Then you came around for it. Now it seems to be in this odd limbo that I think, unfortunately, most people in America don't even understand what's going on.
I don't think most people in Britain understand it at this point, to be
I'm
honest.
sure. So when I was reading your position on this, at first I thought, well, wait a minute. As a conservative and as someone that wants some autonomy over his country, I was somewhat surprised, actually, that you weren't for it originally. So can you explain your original position and then how you changed on that?
There were two reasons why I was on the side of Remain in the EU back in 2016. One was pure personal loyalty to friends. David Cameron was Prime Minister, George Osborne was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and they are friends of mine. And I felt obliged as a friend to support them when they decided to stick with the EU and not to recommend Brexit.
Did that friendship supersede what your feelings were, or was that because you really trusted that they could get it done right?
There was a second reason that swung it.
Okay.
And I think the reason that I was willing to get on board with Remain was that I found the arguments of the Brexiteers deeply unconvincing. I remember one night sitting down and reading a lot of stuff by Daniel Hannan, one of the leading advocates of leaving. And I remember thinking that this was just intellectually completely third class and unconvincing. The notion that Britain would be better off economically outside the European Union wouldn't have passed muster as an undergraduate paper, never mind a graduate paper. So I felt that the Brexiteers' case failed intellectually because they were claiming, implausibly I thought, that you could have a free lunch, that you could leave the European Union and be better off. And that just seemed to me to be intellectually completely deceitful. I think it would have been harder for me if they had said, honestly, this is going to cost quite a bit, but it's worth it. Because if we leave, then we shall have the ability to control our borders, and we shall have autonomy at a time when Europe is pursuing a federalist course. But that wasn't the argument. The argument
was that not the argument? Because that was the argument that
the
I could
argument
hear
was
here
we were going
was
to
that.
get the money. This was the argument.
Yeah.
We're going to get the money that we give to the European Union, and we're going to be able to spend on the National Health Service because we will be, in fact, better off. And that was a lie. And I'm not good with lies. It was a clever lie. It worked politically. And I give credit to Dominic Cummings for crafting a message that was appealing both to Conservatives and to Labour voters. The Conservatives got immigration control, and Labour voters got the National Health Service gets the money. So this was brilliant politically, but it was mendacious, I think, at heart. And so I opposed the Brexit. When it happened, what struck me in the subsequent months was that while I had been on the side that lost, there was a good reason why we lost. And the good reason was that we went around saying how much it was going to cost. And I think we were right about that. I think ultimately at least some of what the Treasury said will turn out to be true about the cost. But that wasn't what people cared about. And when you went into pubs, as I did in Wales and in England and in Scotland, there was a question to which you could not give an honest answer without losing the debate. And I'll tell you what that question was, because I was asked it multiple times. You'd make the case about the cost. Nobody was interested in the cost. They would say, listen, Neil, about the 1.3 million Muslims the Germans have just let in to Germany, because that had just happened. If the Germans give them German passports, can they come here? And the only honest answer to that question was yes. So immigration was the issue. And I think for a significant number of people, in England and Wales especially, it was less so in Scotland where Brexit was defeated, the realization was that Britain had lost control of immigration. The people had been promised net migration in the tens of thousands in the 1990s under the Blair government, and they'd ended up with net migration in the hundreds of thousands. They saw the chaos in Germany. They saw the waves of migration coming not only from Syria but from all over North Africa and even South Asia. And they said, and I remember David Cameron using this phrase, "Get me out of here." And that was the driving motivation for the Brexit vote, and I think it was legitimate. Because I think that Angela Merkel had made a catastrophic mistake in throwing open the gates. I think it will have dire consequences for the future of Germany and of Europe. And I do not blame British voters for saying, forget about the cost of Brexit. We really need to get out of this. So I took the view by the end of 2016 that you had to respect the fact that ordinary people had cut through the crap of the debate and had got to the heart of the matter. And the heart of the matter wasn't the cost of Brexit, which is what I had, I think, mistakenly focused on prior to the referendum.
What was it like for you as a public person and someone that writes about this stuff and puts your opinions out there to have that realization?
I think it's very important if you write regularly, if you are what we call a public intellectual, to be willing to admit that you've been wrong. I think you have to be prepared to say, I was wrong. And I think I was wrong in the sense that what I wish I had done, looking back, was I wish I had said to David Cameron and George Osborne in the spring of 2016, when it was clear that the Europeans were going to make no meaningful concession on the immigration issue, when they basically sent an insulting proposal about what could be done about migration. That was the moment I should have said to Cameron and Osborne, forget it.
Yeah.
You should campaign for Brexit. If that's all they're going to offer you, if they're so completely oblivious to the very real concerns about immigration, then you should campaign for Brexit. Instead of which we stuck with it. And that was David Cameron's great mistake. He should have said at that moment, if that's all you've got, I'm going to recommend Brexit to the voters, and it would have saved him too. So
you think it was just a bad negotiating ploy, that he just didn't use some leverage to say we're going to have to walk away from this?
There was a moment when he should have walked away, and I should have advised him to walk away. So yeah, I think one has to recognize when one's made a mistake with such consequences. The second thing which is worth knowing about this is that the people who then inherited power after the fall of Cameron and Osborne were not the people who had campaigned for and won on Brexit. It was people who'd been on the Remain side. Theresa May became Prime Minister. I always knew that would be a disaster. I did not have high regard for her prior to the referendum. The Daily Mail essentially put her in that position, and also Boris Johnson, Michael Gove and others, because they bungled the leadership contest. So we then ended up with a terrible combination, which was a commitment to Brexit, but its execution in the hands of people who had been Remainers. And I think the result is the worst of both worlds, because right now we essentially have the psychological reality of Brexit. I think the British public, to a large extent, has accepted that we are leaving, but the execution's a total mess.
Yeah.
By invoking Article 50 early on, the UK essentially ceded the power in the divorce to the European Union, and the concessions have come one after another ever since then. And we now find ourselves in the odd predicament that I think Theresa May is saying, that Brexit means you cease to be a voting member of the European Union, but you remain within the customs union, potentially even within the single market, and you accept all the rules and regulations of the European Union. You just don't have any power. If that's the end game, then it's a disaster.
So the people that are trying to stop this now, they want to invoke some pretty crazy extreme stuff, right? I mean, there would be some really very rarely, if ever, used rules. Am I right about this? That would actually allow the stay to occur?
Well, listen, I think there's going to
Without getting into all of the minutiae of everything.
There is a level of complexity in the discussions now in London that is bewildering to most ordinary British people. When people start talking about Max FAC and the customs union and the complexity
well, that's
of the
why
Irish
I asked it in
border.
such a confusing way, because I discussed it with Douglas Murray and he was even a little confused. So.
It's actually not confusing in the sense that what is happening is that Theresa May is trying to get Britain to accept the realities of belonging to the European Customs Union, which would preclude Britain having its own trade policy, with our leaving the European Union's decision-making body. So essentially, in that version, Brexit is just, you have the responsibilities, you just don't have any power anymore, which is definitely not what the British public was told that it was getting in Brexit. The bigger problem in my mind is not one that we've discussed, and that is that all of this will end in tears to the point at which Jeremy Corbyn, the most left-wing leader the Labour Party has ever had in its history, becomes Prime Minister. Because Theresa May is leading the country towards this very unhappy compromise, at some point, the people who truly believe in Brexit, Jacob Rees-Mogg, for example, perhaps Michael Gove, they may decide, well, we can't ultimately accept this, and the government may fall. But the problem is that if the government falls, then Jeremy Corbyn is Prime Minister. If the government doesn't fall, and we go all the way to the finishing line with this Theresa May version of Brexit, then I think the Conservatives will lose the next election in 2022, and Jeremy Corbyn will be Prime Minister. So the worst thing about Brexit is, in my view, that if it is bungled in this way, it will open the door to a truly leftist government. And that will be far more economically damaging than anything Brexit has done. And that's the nightmare scenario for me.
And probably socially damaging, and for
Deeply.
a zillion other reasons.
Deeply.
That you care about.
We should be extremely suspicious of Corbyn and his people. They are committed Marxists. They've been on the wrong side of every issue in my lifetime, with a possible exception of South African apartheid. And I do not trust them with the keys to 10 Downing Street, because I think that their ultimate agenda is a truly revolutionary one. And it poses a threat to the fundamental liberties, the traditions of the Constitution. It's a dangerous, dangerous prospect. And I'm much more worried about Corbyn than about Brexit.
I mean, this is how I feel about what's happening with our left in America, too, that you guys are giving us basically the precursor to this.
I think one of the lessons of history, and now we can bring history in, is that with populism, you get two flavors. In a typical backlash that would come after a financial crisis, the political establishment's discredited. There's a backlash against inequality, all of the things that typically follow a financial crisis. But there are two possibilities. There's the populism of the left, which is the tax the rich solution. But the populism of the right is more potent, because it says it's about immigration, it's about globalization, it's about free trade. And so broadly speaking, and there's a very good study that shows this, after a big financial crisis, the populists of the right do better because they offer a more plausible story. But if they don't deliver, and they generally don't, because it's quite hard to make immigration control and tariffs pay. It's quite hard, actually, to make your constituents better off with those policies. Then the pendulum has a tendency to swing to the populism of the left. And that has happened in Britain really quickly, because Corbyn became popular very soon after Brexit. It's slower here, but the fear must be that if the Trump experiment goes as wrong as the vast majority of intellectuals expect it to, the pendulum will swing to the left of the Democratic Party. And that scenario seems to me more and more plausible. And I don't think that's not an appetizing prospect at all.
That's genuinely scary to me. But I want to back up for 1 second, because the moment that you said a few times happened in these pubs, when you would go there and people would say this about 1.3 million Muslims in Germany. How do you, so if you were listening to the mainstream media, they would say these people are all racist. That's what they would tell you. They're racists and they're bigots. I suspect that's not what you think of these people, although there probably was a certain amount of people that are just racist and don't like people of a different color or a different culture. How do you even have that conversation? Because that's what so much of this is about. Because you, I'm sure, would have a pint with these people and you'd talk to them and realize that they weren't racist, they were actually just worried about their future, which is legit. But if you can't have that discussion because every time you open your mouth, they tell you you're racist, well then, we know what you end up with.
Look, I would be very strange if I took a bigoted view on this subject, because I'm an immigrant. I'm in fact about to become an American citizen in a matter of weeks. My wife was a refugee who got from Somalia originally to the Netherlands by applying for asylum. And so we would be the last couple to take a kind of bigoted view on the immigration issue, because we're immigrants. When I had conversations on this subject at the time of the Brexit referendum, I remember realizing that the opposition to immigration was not plausibly racist, because I remember somebody making the point that he was as worried about the people from Lithuania and Poland coming to Britain as he was about people from Syria and Iraq. And you probably know that people from Poland and Lithuania are pretty white. So here's the thing. What we all need to recognize is that if immigration shoots up, if it grows from, in the case of Britain, 10,000 or 20,000 a year to 200,000 or 300,000 a year, perfectly unprejudiced people will say that's too much. This is going too fast. And that, I think, was the dominant argument. Of course, there are people who are racists in any society, but the striking thing about Britain is actually that it's not a terribly racist place. Did you see many people protesting against Prince Harry's decision to marry an American of mixed race?
I was there a couple of days before. People were very excited.
There were huge crowds. This match is extraordinarily popular with ordinary people. So I think it's hard to argue that racism played any meaningful part. The white supremacist element in Britain is really very insignificant. And actually, one of the ways in which the British like to define themselves is as being tolerant. Memories of the war have not entirely faded, even as the wartime generation gradually disappears from the scene. What was the war against Germany about? It was a war against the ultimate racist state. What hurt Jeremy Corbyn the most in the last 3 or 4 months? The evidence that there are anti-Semitic elements within his faction of the Labour left. That hurt him. And it's important that that argument keep being made because it has real truth to it. And I think ordinary people think that's not good. So I think this is not really about racism. It's not about bigotry. It's about how rapidly should immigration occur? How large should flows be? across borders. And the lesson of history is that if you allow a real surge in immigration, there will be a populist backlash against it. It's what happened in the United States in the late 19th century. At the peak in the 1880s, the foreign-born percentage of the population in the US was about 14%. It had gone up from a relatively low level to about 14%. The same thing has happened in our time. It was down, I think, below 7% in the mid-20th century. In the period after World War II, immigrants were a relatively small proportion. Native, foreign-born citizens were a pretty small portion of the US population. And then, from the 1980s onwards, the proportion surged. And the character of the immigrants changed. The places that they came from changed. And these changes are bound to elicit a reaction. It always happens. And it's not enough for people in the liberal elites, who by and large don't live in areas where immigrants come, to say what a terrible, deplorable bunch of chauvinists you are for not wanting more immigrants. That's simply historically stupid. And the other thing that's stupid about this in the United States is the people on the left who want to legitimize illegal immigration. Now, I think for many people who were attracted to Trump, the issue was the illegal quality of the immigration. The rule of law is a big deal in the English-speaking world. And people don't like to hear anything that simply says amnesty for lawbreakers. Well, if you're a law-abiding citizen and you're suddenly told, well, yeah, the law applies to you, but there are these other people it's not going to apply to, then your natural reaction is, screw this.
That's why I thought one of his best lines, he doesn't use it as much anymore, but during the campaign, we're either a country or we're not, I thought was a really effective line. You either have laws or you don't. I mean, that in essence is the truth. So let's shift to Trump a little bit here.
Sure.
I think that we're kind of in a similar spot with him, which is that it's better than the alternative. That's certainly how I feel at this point. That all of the forces that we've spent the last hour plus talking about would be that much more emboldened against free thought and free expression and open inquiry and all the things that we care about, and historical fact and everything else, if he wasn't president right now.
I am deeply ambivalent about all of this. I think it's very, very hard to say a good word about the personality of Donald Trump.
I'm with you.
It was a reason that I found it impossible to support him in 2016. I think one has to acknowledge that he has used inflammatory language on the issues we've talked about, immigration, that he has a record of lying, which is, even by the standards of American presidents, pretty remarkable. And so the familiar list of things about Donald Trump that most of my friends find objectionable is kind of hard for me to dismiss. But I said ambivalent for a reason. On the other hand, number one, what if he'd lost? I said this to Sam Harris a few weeks ago. Let's run the counterfactual. This is what historians should do. Let's imagine an alternative history. If Donald Trump had lost the election by, let's say, the same narrow margin that he won it, how would all those people who voted for him have felt? And how would they have behaved? To my mind, the election of Donald Trump is a cathartic moment for those people so despised by the liberal elites that they could refer to them as deplorables. The people who voted for Donald Trump are not, by and large, racists, are not, by and large, anything like Donald Trump is personally. What attracted them to Trump were two things, which, as with the Brexit campaign, were legitimate. Number one, they were attracted to Trump's policy positions on trade, on immigration, on Islam, and on the somewhat corrupt liberal elite that had been running the country for the previous 8 years. So I think they were attracted to Trump's policy positions, but they were also attracted to his cultural position. And I think about half of American populism is cultural. What attracted the friends I have who supported Trump to Trump was his fundamental shift in language away from the politically correct talking points of the political class, Republicans and Democrats alike, to a demotic, normal way of speaking, such as you would hear in a typical American bar, more or less anywhere in the country, except Cambridge, Massachusetts, Stanford, California, and the rest. Now, I remember thinking on the eve of the election, if you line up all the people who are going to vote for her, and you line up all the people who are going to vote for him, which line would you rather be in? Remember, at that point, I'm not a citizen, I don't have a vote. And I thought, that's easy. I'm with the people who are so pissed with the political establishment that they're ready to take a chance on this guy because they see no other way to shake things up. The way my friend Jerry Blake put it to me, ex-Marine Corps, ex-NYPD, never went to college, helps take care of my wife's security. Jerry said to me early 2016 two things that stuck in my mind. First, he told me Trump was going to win. But then he said the two reasons why he supported Trump. Number one, he tells it like it is. Number two, he's going to shake things up. By he tells it like it is, Jerry did not mean he is always truthful. What he meant was he talks like me. And by shaking things up, Jerry meant we have to do something because this system as it stands is not in my interests. It's not in my interests economically because it seems to favor China over the United States, Mexicans over native-born Americans, the rich 1% over me, the median household. But it's also about this cultural reaction against the multiculturalism that has become the orthodoxy of the liberal left. So for all my reservations about Trump, I completely got why people voted for him, and I think their reaction, had he lost, would have been toxic. I don't think they would have accepted the legitimacy of the result. I think they would have bought the story Trump would have told them that the election had been rigged, and I think we would have had a poisoned body politic from day one of a Clinton presidency. If it all ends...
Oddly, though, we're having that right now, just in the reverse, right?
It would have been worse.
But we're having a left that's not accepting the legitimacy of the election, and Clinton
I
not
honestly
accepting...
think it would have been worse.
Yeah.
I think it would have been worse, and I think, and this is another part of the story, that for Jerry and his many, many fellow Americans who voted Trump, this has always been a gamble. And they've always had a sense that it could go wrong. You know, when you shake things up, sometimes they break. And I sense that if it all ends in fiasco, which I guess the vast majority of public intellectuals expect, in some combination of Watergate and other scandals, I think Jerry and his fellow American Trump supporters will say, well, we gave it a try. We gave it a try. And I think that's one possible scenario. The other reason that I'm ambivalent about Trump is that for all his flaws, in some ways he's doing a better job on foreign policy than his predecessor did. Because Trump has this superpower that most intellectuals can't understand. He has an unerring instinct for the weakness of the counterparty. It's a kind of almost animal instinct, but somehow Donald Trump can tell when the other side is weak. You could see it in Jeb Bush, you could see it in Marco Rubio, you could see it in Hillary Clinton. And now I think he sees it in the Europeans, he sees it in Angela Merkel. You don't pay enough for your defense. What if I walk out on NATO?
Yeah.
He sees it in Kim Jong-un, he sees it in Xi Jinping, he sees it in the supreme leader in Iran. So my ambivalence is partly my sympathy for Trump supporters, my fundamental sense of why they voted for him, but it's also that in some ways this disruption has its plus side in the way that it's repositioning the United States.
I mean, to me, it's given oxygen to everything that we've talked about here. And that doesn't discount all of the legitimate concerns that you...
Look, the big concern for me, as I mentioned before, is that the pendulum swings the other way. If this all ends in tears, all of those who defended it, even if they defended it half-heartedly like me, will be discredited. And the damage will be irreparable for conservatives and populists alike. The left will be empowered, and they will spend the rest of our lives telling us that we were apologists for the worst president And that's not a scenario that you can discount lightly. For a time, I think it was exhilarating. I'll freely admit that for me, one of the most satisfying aspects of Trump's victory was that all the people I most dislike in this country were in a state of hysteria and shock for weeks. And I remember saying to Ayaan, you know, it can't be all bad if the people I really can't stand are in this state. But you have to, I think, with history in mind, be conscious of the dangers, of the fact that this could end so badly that it does irreparable damage. And the worst damage of all will be if it propels the left of the Democratic Party into power. And that you can't rule out. You can't rule it out. The worst thing about studying history is that it makes you aware of how undeterministic the historical process is, that there is always more than one future. There's the future of triumph, there's the future of tragedy, and there's this kind of other future in the middle, which is a little bit of both. And that's really why the historical moment is bad for restful sleep. One wakes up in the morning, and I'm sure you have the same feeling, wondering what alert will be on your phone and what message will be on your phone. Will the alert say, war has broken out? Will the alert say, palace coup? And will the message say, your reputation has just been destroyed by some accusation or other? So one wakes up in a state of anxiety in the United States of 2018, and that is a reality that I think is inherent in both the culture war that we've spoken about and the Trump presidency, which is in some measure a backlash against that culture war.
We're going to leave it at that, but I am going to demand that you come back. I don't think I've ever demanded that a guest come back. I've asked, but I'm legitimately demanding that you come back, because next time I want to just do all history. And
we barely scratched the surface.
I know, to even barely jump into, I want to do some British Empire stuff and Churchill, and okay, I'm demanding it. Will you accept my demand?
I accept.
All right. It took a long time to get you here, but considering we're both two guys just off planes today, and you're like 87 hours out of whack and jet lagged, and all
who knows what
stuff.
Things we said will be taken out of context on Twitter after this is broadcast.
I sincerely hope everything, because that's how the whole thing goes. This has truly been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for doing this. And send my best, of course, to Ayaan.
I sure will.
And for more on Neil, you can follow him on the Twitter. Although you don't fight with people that much on Twitter, which means you're of strong moral character.
I decided that jungle warfare was not the way to go.
He's a wise man, and it's at NFERGUS.